Fantastic. All right. So, without much further introduction about the topic, you will see much more of it as we go along. I'll take just 1 minute to sort of introduce myself and where I'm coming from with this. I've been in the field of psychedelics research, I would say, for roughly 10 years at this point. And there's a variety of different things that I put out there and that some of you might be familiar with already, but some of you not necessarily. So I do tend to regularly engage with various conferences on the matter of psychedelics research or with media outlets aimed at general public communication, scientific communication, as well as academic research more generally. And one of the biggest studies that I have been one of the lead investigators on, setting up the drug use study, is the Great British Intelligence Test. And that will be the focus of the second half of my talk, where I will discuss some of my results. Um, more like where I am currently. George, you mentioned very kindly I'm doing a postdoc. I have spent 8 years at Imperial College, not complete a PhD during all of that, but 4 of those years were dedicated to completing a PhD in clinical medicine and computational neuroscience. And now I have actually moved after 8 whole years to a different university in South London, to King's College London. And that is where I will be for the foreseeable future, continuing my research and these projects that I'm discussing today as well. So my main interests are in the effects of psychedelics, but not only. It's generally naturalistic use of any drugs under the sun for whatever reason that an individual might want to use that drug. And I'm mainly interested in cognition. Within our lab, our main focus is human intelligence more broadly. We like to refer to it as cognition with its various different domains, which is very much correlated with what we might mean as intelligence more colloquially. But I'm also interested in other aspects, such as mental health, social behavior, patterns of thinking, and more generally, what is the significance of altered states that some individuals might want to undergo in their lives. And today, actually, I will have a special focus on mental health rather than cognition, although I do know that's a very exciting piece of work, as the mental health publications are already out or in review, whereas the cognition one is currently being wrapped up. So I suppose like some of you are attending today because you have been intrigued by the title that I gave to this talk, Seeing in the Dark, and that what that might actually mean. Um, and I was wondering whether to go into the depths of like how the idea of calling it See It in the Dark actually came about when George told me that he's recording this. But it's actually from a placebo song, um, Infrared. And I was listening to that in the car one day, and I was very, very angry, basically, because on that very rainy, typical British forever autumn day, I got the reviews back on one of my papers looking at mental health and drug use in the general population in naturalistic settings. And the reviewer was clearly very upset with my results that didn't fit their personal narrative. And I thought I was doing science a service by putting out results that are not necessarily fitting the norm, because I knew that my study is quite different to what was out there more generally. And I was listening to that song, and there's a lyric there that says, "I can see in the dark." And that's how the whole thing came about. But more generally, what I'm actually using this set of words to represent is the idea that we are in, those of us who are interested in psychedelics research at the very least, we are currently in a situation where we have a very rapidly expanding set of publications. And the quality of the studies that are out there is not always similar between the studies. There are obviously some absolute gems in the literature, but sometimes it's very hard to actually discern what is a result that we can trust and what is one that we can't necessarily. This is obviously not an issue specific to the psychedelics field alone. In science in general, we always need to keep peer reviewing, if you wish, even the publications that are already out there. And there's this graph that I put here on the right, and some of you might recognize the layout. This is from PubMed, and it represents the amount of different publications that have been published in relation to psychedelics since the beginning of time when the first publication was out there. And the little arrow that I put there is to indicate when I kind of started jumping into this field. Um, and it was really at the very beginning of the new boom into psychedelics research, although you can see in the past couple of years that expanded like at unprecedented rates. Um, but one thing was very interesting about when I started, which was that I got so interested into trying to understand what is it that psychedelics do to the brain that I went to the medical school library and I downloaded every single paper that was published on psychedelics up to that point that I could find. And I actually managed to download all of that into one night. And for the next months, I just started reading through. But it became very apparent, even at that time, that we did have some nice literature out there, but we didn't actually have that much knowledge about what was actually going on with the psychedelic experience. And it wasn't mapped out with contemporary methods, that's for sure. So that's really one of the things that prompted me, well, this might be an excellent line of investigation, and that's why I started going on this career track. Um, I started putting a lot of effort into trying to think how can I overcome some of the limitations that the studies to date had, and specifically thinking about, well, how could I best design a study to answer my questions about naturalistic effects of drugs, while bypassing a lot of the limitations that I noticed were present in research, and those type of limitations that made me question whether, well, do we actually know this? Can we actually conclude this from the data, and so forth? And I came up with these 7 pillars. They're by no means exhaustive, and I'm sure there's quite a lot of other nuanced points that can be added to them. But I think it's a very good start to start thinking about, well, how could we facilitate this seeing in the dark, and how could we actually, if we are to set up a study, design it with certain reference points in mind that we might make it really robust and good for answering questions. So that would be, first of all, about the excitement. There's often this belief, well, I'm not sure whether to call it belief or what else it is. It's a natural excitement about studying psychedelics. And having been part of this field for so long, I'm definitely struck with every single new student that comes at the start of their career. They're extremely excited about the topic and don't necessarily consider other aspects to begin with, but just the fact that they are going to study psychedelics is a major win, and everything else might fall on the backtrack. But I would say the first pillar would be don't let excitement distract from rigor. And the second one is to do with the data. A lot of the studies that are out there are survey studies, and there's nothing wrong with a survey study. I have a survey study myself. That's how I primarily conducted my own research. But I think one of the main things when we are running surveys is who is actually going to engage with that survey, especially because for a survey to deliver robust results, someone might need to have a lot of participants. And when we say a lot, we definitely mean like hundreds is a good number, but like tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, if we can, is even better. Um, and when people run surveys on psychedelics, one of the things that I have noticed, mostly on Twitter over and over again, is this specific advertisement, sometimes in specialized psychedelic groups of, this is what our study is about. We want to test that psychedelics have a positive effect on, and if you've had this experience, then join our study. What then happens is that the researchers might publish a paper, and there has been a very famous example on Twitter, which I'm not going to give further airtime by naming the actual authors, but whoever has seen that will know what this is about, where the authors concluded psychedelics are useful for X, when their entire advertisement campaign for the study was, we are looking for people for whom psychedelics were useful for X problem. That obviously has an issue because it excludes people who might have never dealt with X or who had adverse reactions for that particular problem. And it restricts the sample size to those who were particularly interested in furthering a certain point of view. So there's a lot of bias that can come from sample size alone. And this is something not to discard findings of past studies. Those are obviously important as well, but to keep in mind when we do a critical analysis of what we actually know and about who specifically. Um, Another point, which I've mentioned already, is having a large enough sample. Uh, that's very hard, I would say. Um, it's hard because the majority of people who run research are students, and students run research on students. So they might advertise in their networks, and that not only provides this bias that I've already mentioned, but also the numbers might not actually be that high, depending on the popularity of who is putting the survey forward. Um, with my study, I definitely had a very wonderful setup where we were part of a much wider interest of the BBC here in England into our cognitive testing. And we had a TV series and a documentary filmed about our research, which definitely like had an impact in the amount of individuals we're able to recruit. Um, but when we think about why it's important to recruit a large sample, it's not simply because of the good, big numbers look good. It's actually because when you have a larger sample, you have a wider demographic profile. If you want to be inclusive, you can find different subsets of the population that you are not necessarily able to quantify otherwise. And you can also recruit a large enough control population, so to speak, which leads into the next point that I was going to make. Because what often happens is that we see survey run on the drug users themselves, but there's no similar protocol to try to compare with experiences during similar instances of individuals who've never used that drug to begin with. Um, and then the other things is like how is actually that survey constructed? One of the things that is often conflated is what is actually which drug is actually a psychedelic, or other use of drugs that are not psychedelics is not accurately quantified or reported. And sometimes other aspects such as lifestyle choices, like drinking alcohol, going partying, going to raves, or smoking, are not addressed at all as confounds. And obviously, when we speak about things like mental health, which has been a very widely studied topic within psychedelics research, that's very relevant because there's very strong associations between these lifestyle choices and mental health variables that have been noted in the literature for absolutely decades in most studies out there. And finally, the other point that I want to make here is about statistics and what sort of methodology is actually applied. Um, that is often something that is not necessarily available as general knowledge to the general public who might read publications, or to journalists who might write articles and mischaracterize what an analysis is actually showing. But it is the responsibility of the researcher to actually get fully informed at what specific methodology to use to analyze their data. Um, and that's as simple as following the assumptions of the different tests. So, for example, using parametric tests for normally distributed data or non-parametric for not normally distributed data, or doing the right transformations if you want to use one or the other. Um, Appropriately accounting for confounds, because as I mentioned, there's a lot of actual confounds that are not necessarily drug use that might influence and result. And one of the most important, which I can't stress enough, and I have been trying to highlight in every single one of my publications so far, polydrug use, especially when it comes to psychedelics use. The fact of the matter is that most people who use psychedelics in naturalistic settings also smoke cannabis pretty regularly, most of them. And it's very hard to tease apart, well, what are the effects that we see due to the psychedelic, and what are the effects due to regular cannabis use or a history of cannabis use and other drugs sometimes. Um, which sometimes might not even be quantified by the studies or um, might just not be reported um, by the participants anyways. Um, so yeah, these are in a nutshell, the seven pillars that I have spent a very long time thinking about what might be important in running a study. And I have had several attempts at collecting naturalistic data on the use of psychedelics and what it does to mental health, cognition, and other factors prior to coming up with these and setting up the study that I'm going to describe here. George was actually part of one of those before. That was very, very fun indeed. But what I want to present to you now is the results from this large-scale survey that I've conducted and that have generated certain results that were not necessarily in line with the status quo of the field at that time. So this is the Great British Intelligence Test that I have been working on. This is our lab's initiative of trying to understand cognition or intelligence, if you wish, in the general population in the UK. And the BBC, as I mentioned, was very interested in this question. So they filmed a TV series about our work and the Horizon documentary, which aired in 2019 and 2020. And while our TV series and documentaries were out, they advertised our cognitive testing website on their main pages. And that was simply with the promise that if you take our cognitive tests, at the end, you can see your results and how your performance measures up to everyone else in the UK who took the test to that time. So there was this artificial intelligence background, this machine learning background essentially that was showing the scores of participants adjusted to the social demographic profile of other individuals who took the test. And we recruited over 500,000 participants for this. Um, After the recruitment period of time, that is when I set up the drug use arm of the study. So out of the over 500,000 people who got involved during the recruitment stage to take these tests, around 135,000 gave us their email addresses and they said they want to be part of future studies that we may wish to run. And we started contacting them regularly. Oh yeah, I didn't show you this recruitment time scale here. So this is the number of a number of individuals who are engaging at different periods of time during the first 6 months that the study was run. So you'll see like at different times when we had like more public facing advertisement on the BBC, that's when we had more participants engaging with the study. It wasn't planned to be happening during the COVID-19 pandemic. You can see that midway through our recruitment, between March and April, that's when most lockdowns started in the UK, but also worldwide. But our sample is primarily based in the UK. Over 90% of participants are from here. Um, and yeah, obviously, this allowed for a lot of very interesting things that we could have used this cohort for going further. And here, what I have is a bit of an insight into what we did with the cohort afterwards. So, as I mentioned, we had 135,000 individuals who very kindly gave us their email addresses and volunteered essentially to be part of our future research projects. These were members of the general population who simply did our cognitive tests. They had nothing to do with drug use necessarily. It wasn't their main point of interest. Their main point of interest is I want to take these tests that I've seen on TV. We started emailing them every 6 months afterwards. And during this emailing, we were sending them the cognitive tests again, but also questionnaires where we would measure different aspects of their lifestyle or um, as I mentioned, one of the interesting things that I was particularly keen on looking at was drug use and their patterns of drug use. I was interested at what exactly they're taking, how regularly, in combination with what, at what dosages, whether their use is increasing or decreasing between these different time points, and so forth. And this led to an extremely rich data set, actually, that I'm still going through analyzing at the highest speed I can, but there's simply so much data. But there's two particular analysis that I want to present to you today. One of them is published and one is currently in review at PNAS, so fingers crossed for that. Um, it's to do with mental health and drug use during the peak of the pandemic specifically. So, in the first analysis, the cross-sectional one, this had a very straightforward hypothesis, I thought at that time. Um, I hypothesized that, well, those who use psychedelics during this originally intense first 2 years of the pandemic, peak global crisis, would have had better mental health scores than those who didn't use psychedelics, were drug naive, or used other drugs. Um, at that time, this was in line with everything that was out there about psychedelics. It was not long after Michael Pollan published his very well-known book, and like everyone was interested in the benefits of psychedelics for mental health and so forth. So I thought this is a very low-hanging fruit of a publication to start off this analysis with, and just like replicate everything that we know. And that's when the interesting things started happening. But first, I want to come back to one of these pillars that I was discussing earlier, and that is how do we get around the problem of polydrug use? Um, Personally, after playing around with a lot of different algorithms and a lot of different methods for trying to isolate this, I came up with the idea of just using data-driven clusters. And here, what you will see is that um, we can split in a data-driven way the people that were part of this analysis. This was, I think, 37,000 individuals during the very peak stage of the COVID-19 pandemic, so 2020 to 2021, into 10 different groups. And you can see that they use different drugs at the, sorry, at different rates during this period of time. And if you look at which one is the psychedelics, I think cluster 8. So if you look at the psychedelics cluster 8 here, psychedelics are in purple, cannabis is in blue. You can see how you can't take the cannabis use out of the psychedelics use cluster. And that is something that is very necessary to be addressed because you would expect that since both drugs are used alongside the same period of time, they will both have some sort of effect on any behavior or cognitive function. And this is where things started getting spicy, or at least were a bit spicy at that time. And I suppose this is the main reason why George invited me today to talk about this. Um, this is what this analysis indicates the effect size differences in different mental health and resilience dimensions that different clusters of drug users had relative to drug naive individuals. And what we can see, if the effect sizes go to the right, so like if they're higher, that means that mental health scores for that dimension were actually worse. And what you can see here is that virtually every single drug use cluster, with the exception of the MDMA containing one, the one where people were primarily taking MDMA, actually had worse mental health during the pandemic than drug naive individuals. And of course, this is an association, this is a correlation. That's what we can do with a cross-sectional analysis. It's not an intervention study. But this upset a lot of people because we could see that people who used psychedelics and cannabis, for the matter, for example, had worse depression scores. You should follow the red line here, by the way. They also had concentration problems, worse general mental health, higher apathy scores, higher irritability, worrying about many things, and anxiety. And these are the things that the narrative at that time was very clear that, well, if you use psychedelics, you won't have these problems. Now, it's obviously interesting that the MDMA users go in a different direction. I will mention that the MDMA users, that's a smaller group than all of the other groups here. And it's very curious of why that happens. But one of the other things that I do need to highlight here is that very often when people publish their analysis of what psychedelics do to mental health, they group serotonergic psychedelics together with MDMA. And if this difference is, as my personal interpretation is that they might be due to the actual pharmacological and phenomenological properties of the substances go in complete opposite directions, bringing them together into the same group is going to numb this effect, and you're not going to be able to see these different directions. You will likely see like a very slight improvement or something, like a very slight higher score, or less high score, like actually better mental health scores. We don't know. I've not done that extra analysis. But this was the first interesting thing. Then one of the things that we were thinking with our research team when I presented my results to my colleagues first was, well, could it be due to the cannabis? Like, it's not the psychedelics, right? Everyone says psychedelics are great. Could it be because they're smoking cannabis? So the next analysis that I did here was to try to compare within the same dimensions relative to those who are cannabis-only smokers. So in a way to try to um, see, well, if the individual only consumed cannabis and nothing else, because there's plenty of individuals who only smoke cannabis and don't consume other drugs in our sample, um, do we still see these associations? And still, psychedelics and cannabis users were still worrying about many things, and they had higher irritability and worse general mental health. So still some of these associations maintained. Now, obviously, this disproved my hypothesis, but it added new hypotheses worth testing and a new level of understanding. So, essentially, what I concluded is that the mental health of individuals who were using psychedelics during this key crisis time wasn't better than that of individuals who are drug naive, never used a drug in their lives. Um, and what my hypothesis at that time was, is that, well, we will see an improvement only if we apply a within subjects design. So if we take one person and we test their mental health today, give them a psychedelic tomorrow, and test their mental health again afterwards, then we will see an improvement, but they will not be better than someone who's never taken drugs. They'll still have poor mental health. They'll just be better than they were yesterday, relative to themselves. And luckily, that was something that I was actually able to test because we kept on collecting data. And now that we're 4 years in, I was able to actually carry out this large-scale longitudinal analysis. So this is what this paper is currently in review, and we'll see what happens with that. But please, fingers crossed. But do treat these as preliminary findings at this stage. Um, so let me just show you what sort of data went into this analysis. So as I mentioned, I showed you this recruitment figure, just like the first part of it at the start with the different advertisement. This is when we collected data from 500,000 individuals to begin with. And then what you can see here are the different follow-ups. And when we started emailing people to complete surveys alongside cognitive testing in the years that were to come. The analysis, the cross-sectional analysis you just looked at is the first two follow-ups, the peaks here. But here, what I did was to take the mental health baselines prior to the COVID-19 pandemic of the different individuals and compare how their mental health changed to each of these follow-ups in association with what drugs they used and what drug use patterns they had during that time, which is very important because drug use is not a constant thing. Sometimes people use more, sometimes people use less, and so forth. And I'm hoping that you can actually read what's on this graph. It's a very, very big figure. But basically, if you look at the significant stars in black, those indicate differences at baseline. So those are differences in 2019 between those who would have used drugs during the pandemic and those who are drug naive, cross-sectional differences. And then those annotated in blue are differences at follow-up. So comparing their mental health at different stages during the pandemic. And what is actually interesting, the longitudinal difference, so the changes from baseline, those are in red. And you can see there's actually not that many. In fact, there's only two and three, sorry. And those are indeed for the psychedelics and cannabis cluster. So you can see here from baseline to the end of the pandemic, well, the end, when most of the restrictions were lifted in the UK, if you wish, we can see that we have a difference in the psychedelics and cannabis group in depression. We also have a difference in anxiety and in general mental health. And essentially, what happened is that they used to have poor depression, anxiety, and general mental health um, before in 2019. Those scores went down during the pandemic. And actually, here's where the interesting bit comes in. Um, they ended up being on par with those of drug naive individuals. So it really contextualizes the findings of the original cross-sectional analysis during the peak. And I'll go into more detail into what exactly I mean by that in a second. But another thing that I want to highlight here is that drug use is not constant. When we do longitudinal analysis for naturalistic studies, people are not going to consistently, every Sunday, I'm going to do an acid trip, basically. That's relatively rare, I believe. In fact, people take more or less at different stages. And we can see here that the differences in how people take more or less or have no change is significantly different between what type of drugs they use, but also between what time we actually look at those changes. That's very important to keep in mind. And if we are to actually look at psychedelics in general, one of the questions that I had was, well, are those changes in mental health that we see due to people using more, using less, or using the same amount of psychedelics as before at different time points? Um, and actually, what comes out is that those individuals who used more during that peak stage of the pandemic when the crisis was in the air, those were doing worse from a mental health perspective. Whereas all of the different use patterns did not necessarily associate with changes in mental health towards the later stages of the pandemic. So essentially, the people who suffered the most during the pandemic were those who were using psychedelics and cannabis and were increasing the amount relative to their pre-pandemic baselines. Um, but if they decreased that by 2022, when most of the restrictions were lifted, then their mental health actually got better. And that's what we see on that plot earlier. Really looking at these patterns, differences, contextualizes it. So this confirms half of my hypothesis. Indeed, we do see an effect in within subjects' design, but we also see a normalization of scores if there's not a crisis time going on. So it kind of highlights and reinforces this idea that set and setting matters, but it actually brings to our attention something even more important about set and setting. And I actually wrote a paper about this. It's published about the nocebo effect that the poor psychedelics discourse could have on people's experiences. It's published in the journal Psychedelic Studies this year. Um, it's how the world feels at that time that also matters. The global context, the global set and setting might also be associated with this. And this might be a subject for other studies to look at into greater depth by manipulating set and setting conditions. And I think that would be a brilliant way to test whether this is what these findings reflect, really. So that's the end. We reached the end of my talk, really, which still leaves certain time for discussion. I'm very glad to do that. But yeah, just to kind of summarize the takeaways. We need to have adequate methodology for testing our results. I don't claim to have the perfect methodology or the perfect study, but it is one attempt of trying to follow certain principles that did lead to certain findings that I personally trust and that also contrast with a bunch of other findings from the same period of time. There are several studies who looked at psychedelics use during the COVID-19 pandemic and mental health, and virtually all of them conclude that those who use psychedelics felt better. But they lack control groups. put psychedelics and MDMA together into the same group. And also they're based on self-report, how people feel about the experience rather than objective measures. And they weren't run in a prospective fashion with users mostly recruited from social media in response to very explicit advertisement. So I think this says something about being able to test different hypotheses with different methodologies and how it might lead to different results and sometimes, yeah, disagreements between scientists because the evidence might not fit their priors and whatnot. So yeah, thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed this. And I'm interested in hearing your questions and what different points of discussions you might want to bring up. I'll leave my contact details here in case anyone wants to stay in touch or discuss more. And yeah, please let me know what your thoughts and questions are. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Maybe I would have a question, I guess. So, I mean, what I thought was surprising was this chart in the beginning where surprisingly all the MDMA users had better results. Um, I mean, I would have intuitively thought that because you're doing such a wide sample that what you definitely have conflated inside this data is also the specific drug culture. So the way in which the people that certain subgroup of people might have a different relationship to using drugs than others. Which is why I guess it's also with MDMA, people might only be doing it occasionally, but somehow would have intuitively thought that this would also be true for psychedelics. So it's still kind of surprising. I'm wondering, do you think have you ever thought about looking at, let's say, different countries where maybe there are cultural differences in how people consume a drug? So I'm thinking perhaps of the Netherlands, where around 1/6 of the general population has tried MDMA. So maybe, I'm curious whether you know if such data sets exist and if you've ever thought about comparing them.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question because it is one of those pu more puzzling results. There are several reasons. So, some of them I do go into depth into the discussion of that paper that's already published on the MDMA. And the ones that I already discussed there are the pharmacological properties, and the other one is the way in which the drugs might be less susceptible to contextual interference. So, for example, a global crisis might not make someone's MDMA trip be as affected as a psychedelic trip because the simply the experiences are less differentially susceptible to disruption and interference and like spiraling into negative patterns of thoughts, depending on what you hear on the news, for example. So this might be one point, but definitely the differences in cultures and so on might say something. Now, with this data set, it's over 90% of people in the UK, so I can't comment on the Netherlands and so forth. And in terms of awareness about what data sets could be used, I think the Global Psychedelic Survey might have some of that. But with the mention that the Global Psychedelic Survey, which is a great initiative by all means, might have self-selecting participants who might have had more positive experiences, simply because people like to get involved with studies on psychedelics if they want to support the cause, to say so. And that's not to diminish findings in any way, simply to point out that that is something that we need to keep in mind when we interpret results with some caution. So yeah, another thing to say is that those MDMA experiences, there weren't many. I think there were just like around 100 people actually who had those MDMA experiences, which is quite a small group compared to the rest of the sample. It could be that there were very few, but it could also be that the experiences tended to occur indoors, and this again is speculative because I don't have this precise data on what the people did during their experience, but it's speculative. It could be that they occurred indoors and they might have fostered like these interpersonal connections that were really important during that crisis time, during that period of the pandemic. And it could be, in my personal opinion at least, that doing MDMA in the house with your closed ones, with family members or loved ones or whoever people were staying with at that time, was actually a more positive experience than going out raving. Might have made their pandemic experience better. I don't know. Like, we'll never know in the absence of the data, and sadly, I don't have that specific information in the data set, but this is a speculative interpretation here of why we see that striking difference in the effect sizes.
All right. I had another question, just that of clarification, that then in your second study, or the one that you're waiting to be approved, you found a double dissociation. So that which is, I guess, as close you can get to drawing a causal inference from this type of data set. So how strongly does that make you feel about a takeaway message of what you learned from all of this?
Well, can you clarify what you mean by double dissociation?
Well, that you have like correlations going up and down, it's so that increasing one increases the other, but also vice versa, I guess.
Right, so you mean in terms of like how the use patterns changed?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
The
yeah. So
longitudinal
that's
data.
yeah, so that's a very interesting one as well. Um, and I suppose the interesting bit would be to like try to plot some actual curves or like trend lines and so on, but the data I have is categorical. So I think that's very interesting because the concerning bit is the one that shows that essentially increasing your use of drugs is actually leading to worse um, like outcomes. And that increase that's been reported there is actually subjective. So the way that the questions were phrased is like, how did your use change relative to your 2019 patterns? Um, so people who start using more drugs during the pandemic, which it is quite a substantial subset actually, those seem to have suffered the most. Now, it's hard to give an interpretation in the absence of much more data than this. But again, one potential speculative interpretation is that if people were using drugs to fill the hole left by not having other things to do at that time or other things going on, that might actually signal that it's not necessarily using more drugs, but it's actually that is making mental health worse, but it's like an indication that those individuals had worse mental health issues and they were trying to use drugs to cope with that. That's one way to look at it. Um, and then another way to look at it is perhaps reducing drug use while still staying in touch with that meant that people were simply not subjected to the full spectrum intensity of sustained exposure to a trip that is a significant experience in its own right,
Mm,
and perhaps they weren't as susceptible to being negatively influenced because they were just using it less, for
yeah.
example. I hope this makes sense. Like, if someone trips less, there's less chance for them to be negatively influenced during a trip to begin with. So that would be the reasoning there. Um,
Mm,
but yeah, there's several explanations, and we can't know for sure which one is the correct one.
yes. Well, so what I found personally still shocking is that if you think of a psychiatrist and how what type of information they are encountering, that on the one hand you have all this positive uh news about the clinical efficacy of psychedelics, but then when you look at all of their patients and all of their encounters, I assume that the impression they are getting by interacting with people who are self-experimenting is then exactly the opposite. So it's still a rather concerning also in terms of how I think many people encounter institutional attitudes that while we are in this kind of niche of being interested about this topic and positive findings, if you talk with like the a regular psychiatrist at an institution where this is not well established, they will probably have more of a, I don't know, negative opinion, and maybe this kind of explains this a little bit as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's also huge individual differences in general that we may not be necessarily able to quantify fully. One of the things that I realize I've not mentioned about this whole analysis is that all of the scores are adjusted to socio-demographics, including age, sex, ethnicity, education levels, occupation, and also lifestyle factors. So alcohol use, tobacco smoking, uh, meditation levels, physical exercise levels, reading, and I think another one. Yeah, I think hours spent online, time spent online. Um, there's quite a lot of confounds that have been factored out before this, which might have accounted for some individual differences, but it's not an exhaustive list, and it's absolutely impossible to have accounted for everything else that might have influenced, like, for example, familiar relationships, who are people actually living with during that time, because we have to keep in mind that these experiences took place in lockdown as well. So it was naturalistic settings, but for the most of it, legally speaking, UK was closed off. So yeah. Does anyone have any other questions?
Can you show the official conclusion then? You saw and I missed it.
Sure. There we go.
And I have a question
Yeah.
about it. Um, like, I think that one of the main issues here, the correlative attitude to this research. And I wonder if it's possible to make experimental research with this I know, issue, this subject, because of the effects it could have over the participants or whatever. Because otherwise, you can't really, even if it's really good, really big correlative research, you still have some problems within every research you'll ever make.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's impossible to do a perfect study. Like, all studies have their own biases, and I am by no means trying to portray this one as being devoid of bias. It doesn't have some biases, but it definitely has others. Like, did you watch the BBC in 2019 at all, for example? And I suppose that would be like a principal one here. But it lacks other biases, such as people did not know that this was going to have anything to do with drugs whatsoever. So about a third of the sample is drug users, and the control population is part of like drug naive individuals is two-thirds, which allows for this comparisons at scale. So yeah,
But we can't
I
know for sure that some of the two-thirds or answered correctly. Like they could have been shy to admit they are drug users or didn't want to
so
show it's illegal or anything.
So actually, if you had a look at the charts, we do actually know whether they did not want to admit. We did give people the option to say, I just don't want to comment at all, whether yes or no, I did drugs and so forth. And there was um, a relatively small percentage, I think it was 10% of the whole sample at most, who did not want to engage with those questions at all, didn't want to admit I did drugs or not. And we gave everyone the option to tell us that they simply don't want to approach the topic in the research.
You rule them out of the
Yeah.
research?
Yeah, so there are graphs that indicate how they answer. They are taken out completely of the longitudinal
Yeah,
analysis,
but
but
this
there
is
is a
interesting because
contextual
it
one.
might be that if I haven't used drugs, I don't have a reason why to say I don't want to answer. But if I use drugs, I have the reason to rule myself out.
So so
No?
just let me clarify how
Oh,
this
okay, sorry.
actually worked. So the people were asked basically, do you want to answer these questions, yes or no? And then the questions were only displayed to those who said that they have used drugs to begin with. So they wouldn't even see that part of the survey if they weren't drug users.
Yeah, but still, it's part of the randomized idea of going to the general population. And then if we have a group of people, I don't know how big it is because I didn't see the rubric, but we have a group number who are would not who have specific characteristics and does not enter our statistic analysis. You understand what I mean?
Yeah, no, I completely see your point. And so your point is about having a certain group of individuals who do not want to disclose anything about their drug use, and they have different characteristics in terms of socio-demographics, personality, and lifestyle than
Yeah,
um,
they might be
yeah.
drug users with good effects or be non-drug users with bad effects, or we don't know
Absolutely,
actually.
absolutely. You have a very fair point here, which I don't think can be addressed fully. And in here, like to a certain extent, we tried to address that by accounting for social demographics and lifestyle, and also showing the mental health results in the cross-sectional analysis of those who did not want to answer. But it's not possible to account fully, and you have a very fair
Yeah.
point. That's like
No,
I absolutely stand by what you're saying. So yeah.
it's
There's on-
interesting, and
there's
thank you
only so
for
much we can do to mitigate it,
for
and
sure.
we've tried our best. But if you have better ideas of how
No,
to do this, share. 'Cause,
I'm glad.
like,
It's really
I'd love
impressive.
to,
The research is really impressive, and
I'd
thank you
love
for
to
coming.
implement even more stringent, like,
Yeah,
future analysis. If anyone has suggestions, for sure.
for sure.
Thank you.
Thanks for the presentation, Maria. It's fascinating research. I just had a quick question, just to clarify, when you were answering George's question and you said that you controlled for socio-demographic factors, but then also things like lifestyle considerations, things like amount of meditation, time online, things like that.
Mhm.
Could you speak to sort of I definitely understand, like on the socio-demographic side, sort of stratifying based off characteristics, but on more of the lifestyle factors, what was the decision process like for that, especially when certain lifestyle factors, you would expect, psychedelics, maybe the effect of psychedelics is mediated through
Yeah.
the effect on people's lifestyle factors. For instance, meditation would be an
Yeah,
obvious
yeah.
one.
So it was twofold, right? On one hand, we expected different users of different drugs and like non-users to have different engagement with various practices, like meditation, as you mentioned, was one of them that we expected users of psychedelics perhaps to practice more. But the second reason was because our other analysis showed that those who did certain ones of these, like exercised or meditated or read more during the pandemic, had better mental health. And we wanted to make sure that the betterment or like the scores that we see in mental health are not due to these lifestyle choices, and wanted to minimize the impact as much as we could in the analysis so we can isolate what is actually due to the drug.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because then to me it's almost like you're looking at the effect of the drug as sort of a chemical molecule in and of itself, as opposed to, what might a certain experience lead someone to change in their life, and then what are the sort of second and third order mental health benefits.
Yeah, I mean, it is for sure one of the things that, for example, people who exercised more, they had better mental health scores. So by excluding the effect that we of that variable in our analysis, we could say, well, it's more likely that what we see, the residuals of that, are due to the drug, and so on. But yeah, it's definitely not an exhaustive list as well. I think there's a lot more things that could have gone in as well.